In the pantheon of Third Reich military leaders, where the names of Rommel and Guderian have long been household names, the figure of Hermann Balck, a tank general and recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, remains in the shadows. This is the story of a man whom some considered perhaps the best division commander in the German army, and others considered a fervent Nazi, known for his arrogant and ruthless manner of communicating with his subordinates. His military career is a kaleidoscope of fronts, armies, and battles, reflecting Germany's desperate attempts to turn the tide of World War II. Coming from a family with a long military tradition, Balck went through the harsh school of World War I, where he was wounded 7 times and earned the Iron Cross First Class. This experience tempered him and shaped the command style that would fully unfold during the next world conflict. World War II found Balck in a staff position in the Motorized Troops Inspectorate, where he participated in the reorganization and equipping of the Wehrmacht's tank forces. His career developed rapidly, from commanding a regiment in the 1st Panzer Division during the French campaign to leading the elite Great Germany Division on the Eastern Front. It was in the East that Balck earned his reputation as a master of tank warfare, distinguishing himself particularly during the battles on the Chir River in December 1942. He would later lead the 4th Panzer Army, fighting against the advancing Soviet forces in Ukraine.
In 1944, when the Third Reich was already fighting a war on 2 fronts, Balck was transferred to the West, where he faced American troops under the command of General George Patton in Alsace. This was followed by a new assignment in Hungary, where he took command of the remnants of the 6th Army in a desperate attempt to halt the Soviet advance. This constant change of roles and theaters of war, from the endless steppes of Russia to the forests of France and the plains of Hungary, underscores both Balck's value in the eyes of the High Command and the agony of the German war machine. Balck's career, like that of many German generals of the era, is full of contradictions and ambiguous assessments, which is reflected in various sources that interpret his appointments and role in various operations in different ways. His image is that of a commander who combined strategic acumen with the harshest discipline, which at times crossed all acceptable boundaries, as in the case of the execution of Lieutenant Colonel Johann Schotke for drunkenness on duty. Studying his career allows us to gain a deeper understanding not only of the mentality and command style of a Wehrmacht officer, but also of the complexity and tragedy of the era in which he lived and fought. Balck ended his military career on May 8, 1945, surrendering the remnants of his troops to the American 20th Corps in Austria. The incident with Lieutenant Colonel Schotke, the order and its consequences. One of the darkest and most telling episodes in Hermann Balck's career, which largely determined his post-war fate, was the incident with Lieutenant Colonel Johann Schotke. On November 28, 1944, when Balck commanded Army Group G on the Western Front in the Saarbrücken area, Schotke's artillery unit failed to carry out an order for fire support. During the investigation, it was discovered that the commander was heavily intoxicated and unable to perform his duties. Balck's reaction was swift and ruthless. In the context of heavy fighting and a general decline in discipline in the Wehrmacht, he considered it necessary to take the most severe measures. The commander made the decision without a formal tribunal on the spot. This phrase would become key in subsequent accusations. Balck, using his authority, issued a decision in a simplified trial, and Lieutenant Colonel Schotke was shot. This order, given without convening a court-martial, was a demonstration of his authoritarian leadership style, where results and discipline were placed above formal procedures.
In subsequent years, this very episode formed the basis for Balck's arrival in West Germany. In 1948, he was insulted and brought to trial in Stuttgart. The prosecution charged him with murder under excessive pretense. The defense and several similar events pointed to the extraordinary circumstances of the frontal stop. Thus, the human factor is taken into account. The officer's extreme combat exhaustion can lead to a breakdown. However, this does not absolve Balk of responsibility for the lynching. The court found Herman Balk guilty of manslaughter and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. He served 18 months of his sentence, after which he was released early. The Schotke case cast a deep shadow on Balk's reputation, transforming him from one of the most decorated Wehrmacht generals into a criminal defendant in the eyes of the new German prosecutor. The various interpretations of this incident that have emerged in the sources reflect not only assessments of the commander's actions under the extreme conditions of war, but also the political and legal situation in post-war Germany, which sought denazification and the establishment of the rule of law. Trials and the post-war legal context. The end of World War II did not mark the end of Herman Balk's battles. His final and perhaps most humiliating battles unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the courtrooms of post-war Germany. In 1948, after his release from a prisoner of war camp, he was arrested by German authorities. His trial reflected the complex and controversial process of denazification and the young West German states' attempts to hold former military leaders accountable for decisions made under military dictatorship. The central point of the indictment was the now famous shooting of Lieutenant Colonel Johann Schotke. The trial, held in Stuttgart, considered the case not as a violation of military regulations, but as murder committed with abuse of power. The legal context of the time was unique. On one hand, society sought to cleanse itself from the Nazi past and establish a rule of law where lynching was unacceptable. On the other hand, many were still under the influence of militaristic notions of discipline and frontline necessity.
The Balk trial can be imagined as a tense legal drama. The defense likely appealed to the extraordinary circumstances of the war, emphasizing that, amid the collapse of the front and mass desertion, harshness was the only way to maintain the army's combat effectiveness. The defense could paint a picture in which a general, responsible for thousands of lives, was forced to sacrifice one to save the rest. He faced a prosecution that saw his actions not as a matter of strict necessity, but as arbitrary and disregarding the law, even in its truncated military form. A soldier, even an errant one, had the right to a formal tribunal, and the prosecution viewed the refusal of this procedure as a criminal act. Ultimately, a civilian court in Stuttgart found Balk guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Various sources indicate that he served between 1.5 and half of his sentence, after which he was released early. This case was not the only one in Balk's legal biography. In 1950, a French military court in Colmar sentenced him in absentia to 20 years of hard labor for his role in the scorched earth tactics of Operation Waldfest in France. However, neither the American occupation authorities nor the West German government extradited him to France. The fate of Herman Balk clearly demonstrates the tendency of post-war justice in West Germany to prosecute Wehrmacht commanders for crimes that could previously be concealed behind the guise of military duty. Despite subsequent amnesties and the general policy of integrating former military personnel into the new society, a precedent had been set. Generals were no longer immune, and their orders could be examined under the microscope of the Civilian Criminal Code. Terms and wording. Summarized trial. This wording, used in many sources, essentially means a trial without a formal military tribunal. Balk claimed to have acted within the German military code, which allowed commanders to make emergency decisions in crisis situations. However, the civilian court in Stuttgart found his actions illegal. This is the key difference in interpretation. Was this a harsh but legitimate disciplinary sanction under military conditions, or an act of vigilante justice and therefore murder? Sentence length. Most sources indicate that Balk was sentenced to 3 years in prison and served 18 months, a year and a half. This is the most established version. However, some publications contain wording such as served half the sentence, which creates a slight error but does not change the essence. The sentence was real, and Balk spent part of his sentence in prison. Legal and political context. The main dispute revolves around the legal classification of Balk's actions. The West German court considered the case to be manslaughter, that is, a crime against civil law and order, albeit committed during wartime. This is the key difference in interpretation. Was this a harsh but legitimate disciplinary sanction under military conditions, or an act of vigilante justice and therefore murder? Phrases like the human factor at the front, which points to Schottky's possible combat exhaustion, and strict discipline, which describes Balk's command style, are used to create a more balanced picture. They help understand the motives, but do not absolve the legal responsibility for the decision. Rumors and external influence. Some sources point to Balk's complex relationship with the SS leadership, particularly with Heinrich Himmler, which allegedly led to his removal as commander of Army Group G in December 1944. It is claimed that Himmler, lacking military experience but vested with power, sought to purge influential Army commanders. However, there is no direct evidence that these connections influenced the outcome of the post-war trial. On the contrary, the fact that the trial took place and convicted such a high-ranking and decorated general speaks to the independence of the West German judicial system in this particular case. Claims that Balk was an ardent Nazi are also disputed, as a West German denazification court acquitted him of any ties to National Socialism. Thus, when studying the Balk case, the historian is confronted not so much with a lack of facts, but with varying interpretations of them. Depending on how you view it, Balk emerges either as a ruthless commander who carried out vigilante justice or a tragic figure who fell victim to a post-war justice system that applied peacetime laws to the brutal realities of the front.